Okay, good evening, and welcome to those who've just joined. Tonight's webinar, Military Thought and Theory, a brief investigation. Hopefully you're all here for the same thing. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Colonel Retired Charles Chuck Oliviero. Chuck Oliviero is an internationally recognized expert in simulations, supported training, and has twice been the keynote speaker at international training conferences and fora. He has over 4 decades of experience as an educator and trainer, and for 2 decades, he was responsible for designing, developing, and delivering some of the most complex collective training events ever conducted in synthetic environments for military, government, and corporate entities. Colonel Oliviero served more than 30 years in the Canadian Forces, retiring as a colonel. His career included command of Canada's then only tank regiment, the 8th Canadian Hussars, Princess Louise's, establishing Canada's Arms Control Verification Unit, and being both an instructor and the Chief of Staff of the Canadian Army Command and Staff College. He is a graduate of the Royal Military College of Canada, holds a BA Honours in History, an MA and a PhD in War Studies, which is a subject after my own heart, so well done, Colonel. He is also a graduate of the 2-year German War College, and I'm not going to try and pronounce that in German, so apologies there. His last military duty was a special advisor to the commander of the Canadian Army. In 2011, the Minister of National Defence appointed him as Honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the Queen's York Rangers, 1st Americans, and for more than a decade, he was the Adjunct Professor of History and Strategy at both the Royal Military College and Norwich University in Vermont, USA. He's married and has 2 sons, both of whom are serving officers in the Canadian Armed Forces. He's an accomplished author, and he's added a book from the preview that I sent out. So I've read Praxis Tacticum, and I thoroughly recommend it to anyone in the audience. Whether you are a junior officer, a field grade, or a senior officer, it is a fantastic read, putting some of that practical aspect of thought into the thing we drill down and do. And the other 2 books are on my reading list, Strategia and Auftragtaktik. But you cannot really talk about tactics without linking it back to strategy and, of course, how we do tactics through mission command. And I can see that the novel that's coming soon, which I'm sure the Colonel will mention at the end, the cohort Trust, Lies and Friends, a military thriller. So proof that he can both do non-fiction and fiction. Colonel, you're very welcome. I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Just in case some of you are wondering why I'm dressed up this way, I'll be honest with you. I didn't dress up for you. I've just recently come back to the house from our monthly alumni luncheon from my Royal Military College association. So I thought, well, I was dressed as an old boy officer. I might as well stay dressed that way for this. So I'm telling you the truth. I thought I'd keep the lies until the question period. So I am thrilled to be doing this. And if I seem a bit awkward at times, it's because although I'm not shy about speaking to groups large and small, I've never done a podcast. So I'm still making my way through this. I hope that everyone can hear me all right, and that you can see the slides and all of that stuff. So it says here that I'm sharing all as well. So I'm going to change the slide. And so let's get started. So as I say, I'm proud that I keep an open mind on all of these subjects that we're going to discuss. But here are some of the things that I'm happy to have you challenge me if you feel so inclined. Don't be shy. But I'm a Clausewitzian. Let's be clear on that. So I do not believe that the nature of war has ever changed, and I do not believe that any weapon system or weapon can change the nature of war. But what does change daily is how we fight. So, and that's not the nature of war. That's the character. Okay. So the nature of war is fixed, and the character of war is constantly changing. So that's my basis for everything that I'm going to talk about, and you should understand that now. It's a very German outlook, not surprising considering I spent 2 years being turned into a Generalstabsoffizier at the Führungsakademie der Bundeswehr. Probably the best 2 years, apart from command, that I ever spent in uniform. So I'll say it. You should know already, but originally we said that this would be a 60-minute presentation followed by a 30-minute question and answer period. That's not what we're going to do. I'm going to start going through the slides and just roughly talking about things that I think you might be interested in. And at any time that I'm talking and you have a question, you haven't understood something, maybe I skipped over something that you want to talk about, anything at all relating to the subject, interrupt me and we'll talk about it. If I'm going to talk about it later, I'll tell you. I say, well, I have a slide on that. And so let's push on. But otherwise, we'll stop what we're doing and we'll discuss what is of interest to you or anybody else at the time. I'm not sure how you're going to do that. I assume that you can raise your hand at some point and you'll get someone's attention, my co-host.
Everyone should be able to unmute Chuck themselves. I'll only intervene if people are doing background noise. And,
okay, so they can just speak up and say, "Excuse me, Chuck, I have a question." And then
and if for whatever reason that fails, then raising hands will work as well, and I will unmute people.
Excellent. Okay, so there's the ground rules. Let's push on. So, like I said, please feel free to ask me a question and interrupt me. I do not consider it rudeness. I prefer that to a pure question period. All right, here's the outline of how the talk's going to go. We're going to look at the 3 questions that were on the front page, and maybe I'll just, how do I go upwards? Let's see. I'm going to go back and remind you. Those are the 3 questions. What is military thought and theory? What limits military leaders' thinking and thus their actions in war? And how do we improve our understanding of theory in the military profession? So those are the 3 questions. So in the first issue, we're going to have a quick look at theory and theories. Then I'm going to show you a model that I built that helps me and has helped my students over the years gain a better understanding. I want to talk briefly about knowing versus understanding because it's not the same. And then we're going to look at some definitions. Then we'll move to the second issue if there are no questions. We're going to look at training versus education, thinking versus doing, and how these things are linked together. And then we'll go to the third issue, which is teaching theory, how, when, and to whom, and then I'll conclude. So, but it's a very loose structure. And if we don't get to anything in particular that's on the slide, not to worry. We can circle back or at any time. So I'm just going to let someone else into the room. There we go. We're growing in numbers. I see we're up to 13 at this point, which is nice. So, oh, it's not working. So yet again, my reminder. So what is thought and theory? So we need to have this common understanding of what we're talking about. Ergo, let's talk about some definitions for a moment. And there's the definition on the slide. It's a set of propositions to explain something. That's what a theory is, to help you gain a fundamental knowledge. And it becomes the basis, in our case, for our analysis of both war as a concept and warfare as an action. So, as I warned you, I'm a Clausewitzian, and just in case you're wondering, I was a Clausewitzian before I went to Germany. It wasn't just the Germans that converted me. As a young captain, I was starting to read military theory, and of all the theories that I read, Clausewitz, although arguably the most difficult to understand, was also the one who resonated best with my outlook on what combat and war was. Well, Clausewitz says that the purpose of theory was to educate and to organize our thoughts. So Clausewitz is arguably the most quoted theorist and the least read, because it is difficult to read Clausewitz in any language. I've tried in three, French, German, and English, of course. And really, the only finished part of the text for those of you that have read any Clausewitz is book one. There are 8 books, or chapters as we would call them, and only chapter 1 really was edited by him. And then he died, and his notes sat with his wife for several years, and she was in need of money, and she found someone that was willing to compile them and publish them. So a lot of his ideas never got a second look, and I'm sure that had he lived, because you may know he died prematurely of cholera that he picked up on campaign. Had he lived, he might well have refined some of his ideas, although his fundamental ideas are given to us in book 1, and I don't think those would have changed. So what we need to understand when we're talking about military thought and theory is that there is no unified theory of war. It's like physics. There's no unified theory of physics, right? You can be an Einsteinian, you can be a Planckian, Max Planck, you can follow this physicist or that physicist. I mean, they don't agree with each other. They have linkages and intersections, but in some cases, they disagree with each other fundamentally. So in a military perspective, when we look at, for instance, Clausewitz, his opposite number is Jomini. So whereas Clausewitz says there are no principles of war, and for those of you that are perhaps a little better read, you may find it odd because there's a book published. I may have it right here, looking at my bookshelf real quick, and it's called The Principles of War by Clausewitz, even though he doesn't believe in the principles of war. But that really is a mistranslation. It was a pamphlet that he wrote for the Crown Prince of Prussia. And what he was really talking about was those are the principles of warfare, not the principles of war. Whereas Jomini strongly believed that there were a set of principles that if we could find them and learn them and use them, it would almost guarantee victory. And both of these gentlemen studied the battles and the thoughts and the actions of Napoleon. And so they were looking at the same subject and came up with different ideas. Where this causes an interesting dichotomy, the most interesting in my mind, is in the US military. And I don't know, do we have any American serving officers with us today? Anybody? No. Okay. So the US military very strongly believes in the 10 principles of war. And I'm sure that I see from your names, you're mostly from NATO countries. And NATO has its own principles of war based on the 10 that were eventually developed by Fuller, the British general. And yet the American military strongly adheres to its own 10 principles of war and has been moving towards Clausewitzian concepts for the better part of the last 30 years without getting rid of Jomini. So they're trying to square the circle. They're trying to embrace Clausewitz, but not give up Jomini, which you can't do it. And it causes a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? It causes a lot of dissonance in military thinking in the United States. And one of the outcomes of this dissonance is the concept of maneuver warfare, which has become NATO doctrine, was introduced to us by Americans. And it's really a mashup of a little bit of Clausewitz, a little bit of Sun Tzu, a little bit of Jomini, but embraced it totally by the United States Marine Corps, because they saw that it was a better way to fight for them than what they had been doing, which was using army tactics, which was set piece battle. And set piece battle is the way that most armies fought and that most armies still think about fighting. For instance, the war in Ukraine is showing us that armies are still using set piece battle. Thankfully, Ukrainians are better at it than the Russians. The Russians are terrible at it. Yeah, the set piece battle is a great way if you have bad leaders to destroy your own army, and the Russians are proving it yet again. In naval military theory and thinking, we have the dichotomy between Alfred Mahan, an American admiral, who talked about sea power and blue water fighting, and Julian Corbett, who was a British historian who studied naval history. And he came up with a different outlook, but the two are not diametrically opposed. They are sometimes parallel, sometimes they cross, but Corbett doesn't really talk about control of sea lanes. Corbett's more interested in using navies in conjunction with armies and what we now call littoral warfare. But you can't be both a Mahanian and a Corbettian. The same thing happens in air power, where we have strategic power, which was introduced by Giulio Douay in his book in 1921. What was it called? Air Power? No. Again, if I could find it on my shelf, I'd show it to you. But basically, and this is still very contentious, and I get a lot of criticism when I say this, but I can prove it, so I'm not changing my mind. All modern air power theory is based on Giulio Douay and his 1921 book. But it's strategic in its outlook. It says that strategic bombing can win wars to the extent that it can win wars without ground forces, which has been demonstrated to be false 100% of the time, but large air forces still absolutely swear by it. And close air support, which is very similar to the dichotomy that we see in naval power between Mahan and Corbett, where the close air support theories talk about combining air power with land power more closely than just bombing. Of course, it's more complicated than that. I'm simplifying it in the hopes of maybe sparking a question or two. Here's the theory that I want, or here's the model that I wanted to show you. So I came up with this model for my, I see that Gianmarco has a question.
Yes, sir. Just before we move on Giulio Douay, because rightly you say that his theory proved to be wrong. The fact that you can win only with their power, but of course there are some theorists that believe that that theory might be proved right if you just add the nuclear weapons into it. So I'd like to know if you have any thoughts on that.
I do, and
Thanks.
thank you for the question. Adding nuclear weapons to the mix creates all military theory for warfare irrelevant, because once you move to nuclear weapons, there's no winner. There's no such thing as winning a nuclear war. And there's no such thing, contrary to, and for those of you that have attended staff college, every staff college teaches nuclear fire planning, which is almost absurd when you think about it. And of course, I, as a young armored officer at the Army Staff College, we talked about using nuclear artillery on the battlefield, just a bigger bang. But of course, once you move to the nuclear side, escalation becomes almost instantaneous. The loser sees that there's nothing left to do but either surrender or go to strategic nuclear forces, and it then becomes a game of survival, which I question whether anybody can win it. But specifically to Douai's theory, the theory was based on the idea that bombing would destroy civilian morale. And by destroying civilian morale, you would then force the armed forces to surrender and bring the two sides to the bargaining table. And the Italians were not, they were the first to try it, but they tried it in Abyssinia at a very small scale. The first people to try it in a large war were actually the Germans when they started bombing in the First World War, and with Zeppelins. And it terrorized the Brits, but actually had the reverse effect. It made them so angry that they would never give up. And then that didn't last all that long because the technology wasn't there. But of course, when the Second World War came, we saw it come to full fruition. And the bombing of London, the bombing of European cities, in particular cities like Hamburg. I lived in Hamburg for 2 years, and it was just phenomenal to see the destruction. I think 94, 95% of the city was wiped out. And if you have the opportunity to visit Hamburg today, you can easily believe that the city has not changed since the 15th century. That's because the Germans rebuilt the city to look like it looked before the bombing. Fascinating. Dresden, if anybody's ever been to Dresden, there was nothing left of Dresden. The only thing that survived, one of the parts of the cathedral, which they've now rebuilt, survived. And something called the German Wall, Die Deutsche Wand. And the only reason it survived is because it was a wall that was covered in tiles, ceramic tiles made by Meissen. And the city that basically ignited the atmosphere didn't get hot enough to melt the tiles because ceramic is fired at such a high temperature. And so it, strangely enough, it survived. It's beautiful. Well worth going for a visit. Of course, someone will say, well, what about Nagasaki? What about Hiroshima? That's an unfair example in my mind, simply because the Japanese had no way to fight back. If that had happened, say, in let's pick 1942, when they were at the height of their power, and they had the ability to fight back, you could bet that they would have retaliated by probably wiping out the entire island of Hawaii, though, with nuclear weapons. And then the question would have been from the Americans, well, now what do we do? Well, I'm willing to bet all the money in my pocket that the Americans would have destroyed the island of Japan, and on we go. So a bit of a convoluted response to your question, but I hope I gave you some insight. Did I?
Yes, sir. My only thought on that, yes, I mean, you're right that of course if both countries have nuclear weapons, then of course the Douai theory may not be applicable, but not all the wars are the same. So of course, if you have a superiority, like it was the case of the US in 1945, but also in the beginning of the Cold War, so before the Russians had a significant capability, of course, that would change the equation. But I agree with you. The paradoxical thing is that just the Italian Air Force during the Second World War, or the German one, so that were trying to follow the Douai theory, were the one that did not have a strategic bombing capability. They all had medium bombers, but not heavy bombers. And yeah, sure, they tried to develop nuclear weapons somehow, but of course they did not arrive first in the race. But anyway, I got your point, sir. Thank you very much for you.
And just to end the discussion in terms of air forces, you can see Douai's theories at work in Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Vietnam, millions of tons of bombs dropped by the United States Strategic Air Forces, and the Vietnamese never did surrender. So, but you know, when you ask US Air Force officers, is that not proof that the strategy was wrong? The answer is no, no, no. The Air Force was hamstrung. They were not allowed to bomb what they wanted to bomb. And of course, I don't believe that for a minute.
Yeah, I agree, sir. I'm an infantry officer too, so I have to talk with Air Force guys every day on that.
Yeah.
But I got your point.
Okay.
Thanks.
So returning to this model, the Oliviero model, I call it that because I don't have a fancy name for it, but I developed this theory, or I developed this model. It's not a theory, it's a model. Because I was trying to come to grips when I was studying for my PhD on why was it that after over 2,500 years of studying war, we still didn't really have a unified understanding of what it was, other than it was killing. So over the course of my PhD studies, I built this model. And what it says basically is that everything that we do is based on a philosophy. And whether we appreciate it or not, every country, their society is based on a philosophy. Now, it gets difficult for countries like Canada, the United States, Great Britain, because we are heterogeneous societies. But countries like Italy, Germany, France, Sweden, that are almost, not quite, but almost monolithic, have a philosophy that they build their societies on, whether they do it knowingly or unknowingly. You know, I'm Italian. I was born in Italy, and I'm actually, as my father used to joke, I'm not really Italian. I'm Neapolitan. I was born in Naples, and you know, I explain to my Canadian friends all the time that in order to understand really Italian culture, you have to understand that Italians don't want to impose their culture on anybody else. They actually feel sorry for those people who are not Italian. So based on that, they enjoy life and they live for the day at the philosophical level. Upon the philosophy that you grew up living or embracing, Zen Taoism, for instance, in Japan, you then have theories of why things are the way they are. And so we talked briefly about various military theories. And you can see that, you know, if you can see that, for instance, Clausewitz was raised on Kantian philosophy, but Jomini was based on Rousseau and Descartes. And they ended up with theories that are reflections of the philosophies that govern their lives, as I say, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Then policies are created by governments, again, based on the theories of how the society works and how the military works and what is war. And then those policies get translated into strategies, and then the strategies get translated into campaigns, and then the campaigns are fought using tactics, techniques, and procedures. So, and I'm not going to go into depth, but if this idea interests you in Strategia, I go into this model in considerable depth and demonstrate how it is much more than just what you're looking at in that single model. It actually has many, many variations. I just grabbed here, for instance, I think everybody can see, can you see that collection of diagrams? Can someone tell me whether they can or cannot?
Yeah, I'll just spotlight you for that.
Okay. So you'll see that what that model shows you is that inside the greater concept of military theory, you've got all of these pyramids working in different countries. And so no two countries has the same pyramid because no two countries is based on the same philosophical basis and therefore cannot come up with the same theories. So, but as I say, the strategia is actually a civilianization and a re-editing of my doctoral thesis. So,
Can I jump in with a question following the golden rule?
Go ahead.
So there's been a sort of Russia focused conference in Carling this week, and they started off with the sort of Soviet mindset theory context before we started talking about platforms and adaptation in Ukraine. And it struck me that they're looking at your model now, that using a Soviet model, maybe not so current in today's Russia, but certainly going back a decade, 2 decades, you really can track it as you see there. Although we gave them a lot of stick for the sort of simplistic battle drill for conscripts in the TTP box versus our kind of blue sky thinking tactics, which every lieutenant has the ability to be a Napoleon.
Right.
You really can track the golden thread all the way back to the philosophy. I would say my personal experience has been that the first 3 layers are kind of where I would see military officers having interest and agency, and the lower ranks towards the top of the model. Sometimes we often cry out, what is the strategy? We've just been told to do activity. We have policies that can sometimes be more based on the resource available than the outcomes or theories underpinning it. So I just wonder how, I don't disagree with your model, I just wonder how practical it is in the West, especially in the modern West, where a week is a long time, how much the bottom layers stand up, and therefore kind of what we as military officers reading your model should take away. And apologies if I've stolen some of your sandwiches from later.
No, not at all. No, great. That's a great question. So I had not intended to spend a lot of time talking about it here because but in my book I make the point that, first off, the reason that this model is important for military officers is so that they understand the environment that they're living in. Right? So if you understand that the reason that you're having so much trouble as a colonel on staff because you don't understand the strategy that's been given to you by the commander of the Joint Staff, you should look at who the commander of the Joint Staff is and what direction he's given. And then you might discover that, oh, hang on a second. He graduated from Princeton University. And when he was at Princeton University, he studied under this fellow. And that deeply influenced his greater thinking. Here's an example. So last year, I for about 4 or 5 years, I had a team of retired colonels that I led, and we traveled the world. And non-NATO countries, we ran a strategic studies seminar, 1 week long, sponsored by the Canadian government, paid for by the Canadian government. And I met some of the most interesting people around the world, Africa, Asia, spent a couple of weeks in Jordan. And one of my students on one of these courses, I had the great pleasure of having a syndicate that was mostly Ukrainian. This was before the war. One of the students, she had a PhD from a Chinese university. And I thought, wow, she's well educated and interestingly so, for a Ukrainian lieutenant colonel. She was actually a public relations lieutenant colonel in the National Guard. It very quickly became apparent that she was absolutely hamstrung by her education because she had gone to a Marxist university. And every time I asked her a question in discussion, like right now, open discussion in syndicate, her answer was always the same. Well, Colonel, I did not receive that question yesterday, and so I did not have time to prepare an answer, and you haven't given me answers to choose from, so I cannot answer you. And she spent the whole week falling back on that. Because, of course, in the Marxist theology, in the Marxist philosophy, there is a set way to answer every question. Free thinking is not something that you are trained to do. So it gives us an advantage as you rise to high rank and you become the commander of the joint force, and you have to come up with a strategy based on a policy that your government has decided on. To know that your opponent has this thinking helps you. At the same time, one of the other models that I won't waste my time thumbing through my book trying to find the other diagram, but one of the diagrams that I come up with uses this very same pyramid, but it points out that, for instance, you can, if you're not careful, you can end up with a syncretic pyramid. Now, for those of you that don't know what synchronism, not synchronism, that's the wrong word. I'm struggling. But what it means is that you take bits and pieces of different philosophies and you weld them together, and there's no unifying force. So they are not internally consistent. And that's what I was talking about when I said that the US Army has this internal difficulty, because at the theory level, even if they all have the same philosophy, America is number one, we are the best country in the world, freedom is worth dying for, democracy is the only way to live, etc. When they move up to the theory model, or theory step in the model, they have this internal conflict because they are trying to rationalize how to be a Clausewitzian with the fact that there are 10 principles of war and the commander wants you to tick all the boxes. So that's why I think it's important for military officers. And you're quite right. The higher you go, the lower the rank, the less control you have. But by the same token, even, corporals should study this, because it helps them make sense of what their bosses are telling them. And same thing with captains, same thing with majors, colonels, etc. Does that help?
Yes, and I haven't seen it personally like you have, but I do hear that a lot, that it's often used as I tangent into wargaming, all too obviously, that when anyone says, are you not worried by sort of Chinese wargaming? The answer sort of comes back, well, people who've been over there and seen it tell me that basically they wait to be told what to do, so they don't use it in the same way that we use it. Exactly. To sort of expression and creativity and challenge orthodoxy. They use it to confirm orthodoxy, and to do it by rote as if that's going to generate the answers. So there is something to be saying, to be shackled to the bottom of your model. So yes, I do agree.
Okay, great. So let's go to the next slide. So understanding. Right. So I like this slide because it reminds people that most of that what we hear most often is wrong, right? We often hear, yes, we deprecate the people who are teachers because, those who can do, those who can't teach. Well, that's a misquote by George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright. The real quote is, those who can do, those who understand, teach. In other words, we all learn to do something, whether it's strip and assemble a rifle, put together an artillery fire plan, launch an ambush, fight through an ambush, whatever. And if we understand what it is that we're supposed to do, then we can teach it. The reality, though, is that living in the military is not just responding to very simple issues like set up an ambush. It's a question of, there are more nuanced problems with an ambush than just setting it up. And when you understand exactly what the purpose of your ambush is, or how you should properly conduct an ambush, then you can teach it. And I fear, it's been my experience, that too often those officers and senior NCOs who are given instructional duties don't truly understand what it is that they're teaching. They are just repeating something from the manual. And that can lead to some great difficulties, right? This is a great quote that I found in Charles de Gaulle's book, The Future of the Army. And I know that Charles de Gaulle is not held in very high regard outside of France, but you got to give the guy a lot of credit because he was very well read, and all of us should be at least familiar with the collapse of the French army in 1940 when the Germans invaded. But it's common knowledge, I believe, by now that the French had more tanks, more soldiers, well-trained, better defenses, and yet they collapsed like a house of cards because they became so demoralized at what was happening, and they all gave up. One of the guys that refused to give up was Charles de Gaulle, and he was a tank brigade commander as a colonel. And he was very well read, very well studied. And apart from being incredibly stubborn, he was someone who understood that the French could have beaten the Germans if they had had better doctrine. And one of the things he says in his book is that when you look at the victories of Alexander the Great, what you really find is you can trace it all back down to Aristotle. If you use my model, right, the basis of the victories of Alexander the Great, one of the greatest commanders the military has ever known, are based on what he was taught, because, in case you didn't know, Aristotle was his tutor. Of course, Aristotle taught him nothing about the military. Aristotle taught the young prince how to think. Let's look at some definitions real quick. So I'm just going to give you a second rather than listening to me speak. I'll give you a second to read the slide. So, is there anyone who takes exception with my definition of what combat power is? Okay, so I will assume that we use NATO standard and silence is acceptance. So when I was wearing my uniform and when I was teaching, I would always base everything I taught my subordinates, whether they were subordinate to me because I was the commander or whether they were my students because I was an instructor, would always refer back to combat power. How is what you are doing reflected in your ability to exercise combat power? And I have an example later in the presentation if we have time. Well, and I'll show you a very simple example of how, with no change in disposition on the ground and only a change in how you think, can fundamentally change how much combat power you can exert. And Napoleon called it coup d'oeil, his ability to go to a battlefield, have a look at what was going on, and determine how to arrange his forces in order to defeat his enemy. And not quite the same as coup d'oeil, but the German concept of Fingerspitzengefühl, which quite literally means the feeling between your fingers when you rub them together. And that term is not actually military, it's cultural, because a carpenter has Fingerspitzengefühl, his ability to manipulate wood, and an engineer can feel when his designs are working properly, etc. So, but in terms of
be a free agent at the season. Those three players up in the air.
is somebody asking a question?
Brown. Here's more from 49ers GM John Lynch. We're here today on a talented wide receiver.
Oh, no, somebody's just listening to the radio, I think. Okay. So let's move to the definition of tactics. So the art and science of organizing a military force with a specific goal in mind. And this is the basis of my first book, Praxis Tacticum, because I maintain that in 40 years of being either a serving officer or an instructor or a professor or doing things like I'm doing right now, the one thing that was never taught by Canadian military, I can't speak for other militaries, but my suspicion is it's true everywhere. You're never taught tactics. What you're actually taught is drills. And you are left to your own devices on how to combine those drills, those techniques and procedures to come up with tactics. They're not the same thing. And we do ourselves a disservice because our term, TTP, lumps together things that are dissimilar. And I'll get to that in a minute. So I talked about TTPs. So here are techniques. And now a definition of what is a procedure. So it's a checklist, right? It's something that you go through without thinking because that's the way it's done. That's the way you've always done it. So don't think about it, just do it, right? A pilot's startup checklist. So he doesn't have to think about what he might miss. He just follows the list, checks off the boxes, and he knows he's ready for takeoff. So, but what limits a leader's thinking and actions? Well, it's the way we study. It's the way we teach our leaders, whether they're corporals or officers or field marshals. We focus on the process, okay? And that is a mistake. It's good for privates and corporals and sergeants to be trained in processes. It's good for officers to learn what is the thinking process for coming up with a solution to a military problem. But too often we focus so heavily on the process that we forget what it is that we're trying to get them to understand. Not just know how to do, but to understand, right? So rather than just giving them a fish, we want to teach them how to fish, right? And of course, I can't show you this quote without the old army joke. I don't know if it's true in your armies, wherever you're from. The old army joke was, show a man how to light a fire and you'll keep him warm for a day. Set a man on fire and you'll keep him warm for the rest of his life. The problem we have in the military is that, generally speaking, the military as a profession holds thinkers in lower regard than actors, right? Officers, less so now than when I was a young officer. When I was a young officer, I was a rarity in my regiment because I actually had a bachelor's degree. The only other guy that had a bachelor's degree was the senior subaltern and the commanding officer. Everybody else had joined the regiment right out of high school. But my degree was in history. So, but at least my degree taught me how to think. But what was really important as a junior officer was whether I was a man of action, whether I would make decisions, rather than making sure that I knew how to make decisions. And I think that we suffered, and we still suffer. And you only have to listen to some very senior officers talk publicly, and it's embarrassing sometimes, listening to a 3 or a 4-star explain that the nature of war has been fundamentally changed by drones. And it's like, I'm sure that that's not what you mean to say, even if that's what you're saying. I'm not telling you that military leaders should not be active or decisive. But what I am saying is that we need military leaders at all rank levels to be well-read, well-educated, understanding basic philosophy, understanding things like ethics, morality, psychology, sociology, because all of these things go into a leader making a decision, right? And for instance, one of the things that when I was in my third year at military college, my academic mentor was a retired U.S. infantry officer, colonel, and I was preparing to pick my courses for my third year, and I went to my mentor and I said, Colonel Denton, I'm not sure, I want to study history, of course, so I've got my history courses chosen, but I have room for an elective, and what do you suggest? And he said, philosophy. Take third year philosophy. And I had never studied philosophy, and I was intimidated. And I asked him, I said, why do you want me to study philosophy? He said, because it'll push your brain, it'll make your brain hurt, and it'll give you an insight into the complexities of decision making, especially if you're going to be a career Army officer. So I took philosophy. I damn near failed because it was so hard for me. But I think back and realized that Colonel Denton did me a huge favor by forcing me to learn about how philosophy guides human life. It was amazing. And I've already talked about putting an inordinate focus on TTPs, drills, as opposed to focusing on the tactics, which is actually something that we
Yeah, no,
don't.
before you move on, you have a question from Lex.
From Lex, okay,
Hey, sir, can you hear me?
I can.
Good afternoon. My name is Lex Luciak. I'm an OC over at 3PPCLI.
Okay.
And it really spoke to me when you, having also been a product of RMC, going through the infantry training system with my last course being combat team commander. It really spoke to me in terms of that still we don't talk tactics in school, in the schools, whether it's the tactics school itself with tactics in the name or the infantry school. And I was just wondering, like, why do you think that is?
Well, Lex, thanks for the question. And I got to tell you, I love Patricia's. As a captain, I've been in all three infantry battle groups during my career. I was a captain I was a lieutenant in the RCR battle group. And then I was a captain, battle captain of a half tank squadron in, I guess, was it 1st Patricia's in those days in Victoria? And that was wonderful. I had a great time. And then as a squadron commander, a tank squadron commander in Germany, I belonged to the Van Duze, the Royal 22nd Battle Group. And it's fascinating, the different personalities of the different regiments and how those personalities, going back to my pyramid, are demonstrated based on the philosophies of the regiments, because the three regiments have three fundamentally different philosophies. But to answer your question, I think it's because up until even today, the Canadian Army believed that the definition of tactics was not the one I gave you. The definition of tactics was, it's the opinion of the senior commander on the ground. And I'm sure, Lex, that you've heard that expression if you're a Canadian Army officer. And it comes from our British background where, if you were the boss, you got to make the tactics. And so it didn't matter why you had made the decision. You were the senior officer, you were the commander, you bore the responsibility. And so the definition of tactics was, well, whatever the commander wanted. Because if we had not espoused that definition, then a lot of military disasters that have occurred in history would not have occurred. I mean, if the British cavalry did not believe that tactics were the opinion of the senior commander, the Light Brigade would never have charged the Russian guns. Why would they? Everybody in you didn't have to be a genius cavalry officer, of which there were very few, sorry to say, to understand that cavalry doesn't charge artillery. But they did anyway, because, well, the commander must have a good idea. He's the commander. Off he goes. The fact that he was probably the biggest idiot in the whole brigade didn't help. So I don't mean to make light of your question, Lex, but I think it's as simple as that. I think it's as simple as going back to understanding what is the definition of tactics. And in fact, if you'll humor me, I'll go to the next slide, because the next two slides, I think, might go a ways to answering your question. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds great, sir.
Okay, so we use this term, TTP, and I've defined the three terms for you, but what we don't talk about is the linkage, right? That what is the linkage amongst these three terms? Okay? And the reality is that two of the terms are similar, and the third term is actually an outcome based on the relationship between the other two. So that's why the term TTPs confuses us when we take it apart, because techniques and procedures, as we saw from the definitions, are very similar. But when you combine techniques and procedures, the outcome, the precipitant in chemical terms, is a tactic that you are going to employ in order to solve a problem. But if you don't understand that, then there's no point in teaching tactics, because tactics to you, if you don't understand that relationship, is just something you do offhandedly, right? Based on what you're faced with. Do you see what I'm saying, Lex?
Yeah, I understand. I understand the
Makes
relationship.
sense?
Thank you, sir. Yes,
Yeah.
that's
Okay, good. I'm glad. Other questions? No? Push on? No. All right. So,
Colonel, you've got a question from Alistair Luft.
okay.
Hi, Colonel. Thank you so much for this. And just a quick, I guess it's just a quick question. One of the simplest, I guess, conceptualizations of the relationship with tactics and techniques that I've come across over the past few years was actually by a correctional officer in the United States. And, leveraging, I guess, or adapting it from a sort of an individual level, he had come up with sort of the basic thing, goals dictate strategy, strategy dictates tactics, and tactics dictate techniques in terms of somewhat of a hierarchy. And I know that, leaving aside in our context, it doesn't address perhaps the operational level, but I do have a follow-on question on that. But I guess, is that, I guess, accurate in terms of the relationship between what you're seeing between the tactics, as an overall, based on a totality of circumstances, then impacting choosing a specific technique or procedure for what you're trying to accomplish?
It is and it isn't. The concern I have with the definition that you've just given me, I like it. And if you were trying to explain something simple to a corporal with 1 year's service, or maybe a sergeant who's only been in the Army 3 or 4 years, then the definition that you've just given would probably be very useful and very helpful. It tends to fall apart at company and squadron level, because the tactics become far more complicated, and so they aren't quite so automatic. And you need to, the German Fingerspitzengefühl, you need to have more of an understanding of how to combine, recombine. It's sort of like, we've got, I'm not trained in music, but what have we got? Three on the scale of music, we got like a dozen notes, and yet we've got millions of hours of music. How is that possible? Well, we constantly combine and recombine the notes, change the tempo, and it gives us new music. And the same thing is true for tactics. So if you tend to have too Cartesian if you understand what a Cartesian thought is, it's, you know, it's first step, second step leads automatically to the third step. Tactics are not Cartesian. Drills, techniques, procedures, those are Cartesian. Tactics is an outcome of how you combine, recombine, stop, change, recombine again. That's what a tactic is. Does that help?
It does. It actually, notwithstanding his explanation is those kind of simple maxims, so to speak. The broader explanation that he gets into very much elaborates on some of that in terms of tactics being much broader and also dependent on the, like I say, the totality of circumstances to guide it and being not necessarily as fixed. So yeah, it does make sense what you're saying, and the additional complexity as the organizations involved start to get bigger and bigger. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I saw there were two hands up. Did the other question get answered? Okay.
No, sir. If I'm the second one.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you your opinion on the importance of intuition in all this.
Okay.
I mean,
Yes.
you can read, of course, hundreds of books about tactics, but that does not necessarily allow you to build that coup d'oeil that you mentioned from Napoleon or the equivalent German. So, and because this is one of the main problems that we have, of course, you just build your tactical understanding and knowledge through experience. So an army that does not fight, even if it does train in the more realistic way possible, does not allow really to have those experiences that build the commanders that were so successful on the battlefield. And of course, this is, I believe, relevant because wargaming is one of the measures that can, in my opinion, and others, it's not only my opinion, that can mitigate this problem, because allow people just to solve a lot of tactical problems, even if, of course, it's not like fighting a battle. You just mitigate that risk. I don't know if you agree with that, sir.
I do agree with that. And that's why, you know, I spent 20 years with simulation after I left uniform, but 90% of my work was with the military. So I've seen this a lot. But there are more ways than just simulation and more ways than just reading, because of course, you know, in the past, before we had computer simulation, the Germans invented wargaming with their own rules, and once a year they would have an army war game scenario, and the whole army, the Prussians, would gather the senior officers and the general staff officers, and they would all ride out to the piece of ground that they were looking at, and they would have a war game on the ground, or what the Americans now tend to call staff rides. And in this way, senior officers and junior officers were given the opportunity to gain experience, and through experience gain what in civilian life we consider judgment, and then in battle becomes intuition. And there are lots of different ways to get this. For instance, just as an example, I'm sorry, I think you told me you were an infantry officer, is that right?
Yes, actually, mountain infantry and army aviation. So I'm a
Alpini. Were you? Are you Italian?
Yes, I am, sir.
So you were Alpini.
Yeah, I am.
You
actually.
are Alpini. Auguri.
Grazie.
So one of the ways that, you know, I used to train my officers to gain intuition, battlefield intuition, coup d'oeil, as Napoleon called it, as well as little. We didn't have computer simulation when I was a tank squadron commander or even a commanding officer, but would be to take them out onto a piece of ground and look at the piece of ground and then pose a very simple problem. Like, okay, you're a tank squadron commander. Everybody see the hill 2,000 meters to our front. with the copse of woods on the left, etc. I said, you've got 3 minutes. Tell me how you're going to get your squadron onto that piece of ground the quickest way possible, because that's going to be not your objective, but you're going to attack from there, right? And of course, the young officers, most of them had only just come from the school, and they really didn't know a whole lot. They knew what they were taught. And of course, I would always pick a piece of ground that would trip them up in some way. And, you know, for instance, without pointing it out to them, the low ground between where we were standing and where the hill was very green. Well, you know, if you lived more than 20 minutes outside in the army, you knew that when grass was really green, you weren't going to take tanks there. It's very green for a reason. It's wet, right? And so one of the ways you build intuition is by making these mistakes. And some of the young officers and some of even the more senior non-commissioned officers might say, well, you know, we got so little time, we have to rush straight ahead. I say, excellent. Okay. So what are you going to do with the tanks that get bogged down? Bogged down? Why? Well, you know, because, or the other way to do it is to do a map study and pose a small problem. They look at the map, they solve the problem, then you say, okay, everybody on the bus, let's go to the ground where this map is. And what we would discover is that the map pretty closely approximated what was there. What the map didn't show was that in spring, the ground was flooded. And the only way to cross the ground was on the road, which meant that you were advancing one tank at a time. So you can gain this type of experience, this type of intuition by arguing with your brother and sister officers, doing tactical exercises without troops. One of the things that I was trained by my sergeant major to do as a young officer was, and it used to drive my wife crazy. The garrison that we were in was a 5-hour drive from where our parents lived. And so whenever we would drive home, as I was driving down the road, I was constantly looking at the ground and wondering, if I had to stop this car right now and launch an attack, where would I launch it? To the left or to the right? Could I use the road? You know, constantly learning to read the ground, as we say in English. And over time, and sometimes you're born with an ability. We've all met individuals who just have a real sense for how ground is to be used. For those of us that were not born with that, we have to study it. And sometimes it's studying ancient battles and why commanders chose the way they did. Sometimes it's simulation, which is really nice because in computer simulation, you can set up the problem and then you can run it 1,000 times in an hour and see how many times it worked the way you wanted it to and how many times it didn't. So, I did that when I first started playing with simulation. I'd take a tank squadron, I would create the problem, I would map it all out, and then I would run it at 10 times normal speed with an automatic enemy. And I discovered that some of the drills that we teach are very effective because the simulation would prove it, where, 99 times out of 100, if they did the drill properly, they would win. If they did the drill improperly, they would lose. So that's my answer. Here's the
whilst you were talking, Colonel, Gavin has also got a question. So I'll just, Gavin, if it relates to this bit, then shoot. If not, we're going to move on.
Gavin?
Yes, absolutely, sir. Can you hear me?
I can.
So I just had the thought as you were answering that question, when a problem does come across that commander, as a subordinate, how do we inform our higher commander best to improve their decision making? Say they may not see that piece of ground or they're a tactical bound behind. What's our best kind of actions we can take as a subordinate commander to help them inform them in their decision making cycle?
Well, that's a complex problem that you've just posed, but a real life one, Gavin, because we all talk about, mission command and leaders taking initiative. But what do you do when your commander is a bad commander or he doesn't have the same tactical ability that you do? And I can tell you from personal experience that I have lived that situation. And sometimes you have little or no choice. The best you can do if you are faced with that is when you confirm what it is that the commander's intent is, frame it in such a way as to say, sir, I understand, or ma'am, I understand that your intent is for me to do the following, and that you foresee me doing it in this way. But I'm here on the ground, and if I do it the way you want me to do it, it may be unacceptable casualties. I understand what it is that you want me to do. You will, of course, allow me to solve that in my own way, slightly differently, I hope, sir. And you can, you know, if you're lucky and the commander says, oh, okay, he sees something that I don't see, go ahead, just make sure that you accomplish my intent. If you don't, let me give you an example. Follex of 88, Follex of 1989. I was in the Royal 22nd Battle Group with the tank squadron and attached to an infantry company, and we were facing an enemy position. And while we stopped, and it was a German Leopard 2 tank battalion. So 39 Leopard 2s. I had 19 Leopard 1s and a bunch of 113s. And the commander on the radio said, I want you to move further up the road and take the gap in the wood line. And while we were waiting for the commander to make his decision, I had sent my driver, I mean, this is Follex in Germany, so we did a lot of things that were perhaps not realistic, but I told my driver to get in a Jeep and to drive through the wood line and see what was on the other side, because we knew there were tanks on the other side, but I didn't know how many. So if it was a platoon of tanks, 4 tanks, not a problem. We had a lot of combat power. It turned out the entire battalion was actually sitting at the crossroad, out of sight. And he came rushing back and he said, Major, I've never seen so many tanks in one place. I said, well, it's the whole battalion. I said, were they Leopard 1 or Leopard 2? And he told me they're Leopard 2. So the company commander and I called back to the command post and said to the battalion commander, listen, what you want us to do, what I really want to do is I want to swing around to the south through the open ground and then into the woods and come at that intersection from the south, not up the road. And the commander denied us. He said, nope, you don't understand. And you know, I wasn't commanding, I was the supporting commander. And the infantry company commander, God bless him, went back one more time and said, Colonel, if we do it your way, it'll be catastrophic. And he said, stop arguing with me. Do it. So we did. Now, you know, would we have done it in real war? No, we would have ignored him. But it was Follex. And so we mounted up and we went racing up, did a frontal attack. And as soon as we got to the top of the hill, umpires with white armbands came out and said, you're all dead. Move to that field. You're out of action for 4 hours. So the best you can do is to try and convince your commander that maybe there's a slightly better way because you see it differently based on where you are compared to where he or she is. But in the end, if the commander says charge the guns, then I'm afraid you may not have a choice. That may be an unsatisfying answer, Gavin. I'm sorry.
That is a perfectly satisfying answer, sir. Thank you very much.
Let's look real quick. We're coming up, but we got 15 minutes left, and I still got a few things I want to talk about. I want to show you this practical example. Some of you have probably read the slide while I was blathering on, but this one, I find it infuriating. Having done lots of battlefield tours with Canadian veterans and German veterans, and of course being trained by the Germans, there was never an issue of not understanding what they were saying and knowing German doctrine. And you know, during the Second World War, the Germans knew exactly what the Canadians and the Brits, because we used exactly the same tactics. We had the same doctrine. And they beat the crap out of us time and time and time again. How did we end up beating the Germans? We basically out-muscled them. We had more resources and more manpower, and they basically bled to death. They just, you know, they didn't have enough ammunition. They didn't have enough troops. They became demoralized knowing that the war was coming near the end. But, you know, this example is taken from both talking to vets after we invaded Normandy and vets on the Canadians' fight up the boot of Italy, that we would attack with enormous artillery. And of course, the Germans knew that we had lots of artillery and had a well-prepared defensive position. And once the artillery lifted, we would then launch the attack. While we were launching the attack, the Germans were already leaving the position. And they also knew that once we took the position, they could launch a limited counterattack to see if they would dislodge us. And if they didn't, they were already setting up their next defensive line, which was prepared. And they also knew that we wouldn't push on. If we ever broke through, Napoleon said that there were actually 3 phases to war. There was the preparation, there was the attack, and there was the pursuit. Because the pursuit was designed to destroy your enemy, because you now have them off balance. We never did that because our training told us not to. Because our training, even when I was training in the 70s, we always consolidated on the position after we took it and waited for more orders, as opposed to, we've taken this position. If we keep moving, the enemy will have to keep moving. But if we wait on this position, the enemy will set up another position. So sometimes our doctrine doesn't help us. So let's push on. So the last question, how do we improve? I think we need to include more theory. Theory isn't just for officers at Staff College, it's for everybody. And we introduce it too late. By the time you are expected to read Jomini, Clausewitz, and it's true in the Navy, it's true in the Air Force. My elder son is an Air Force major. He has never been on a course where they talked about air power theory, never, as a major. So that's one of the things we should do. Yeah, I mean, think about it. You know, the military profession does it backwards, right? Imagine if you went to medical school and that you studied for 4 years as a doctor. And in your 4th year, they introduced the concept of circulation of blood or immunization. They don't. They introduce those concepts at the beginning, and then you build on that to become knowledgeable on how to practice your profession. We don't do that. We teach the drills, the procedures, and the processes, but we never really answer the question, why? And I remember when, see, I came to the Army later in life. I had been a naval cadet. And so I was already a commissioned officer when I joined the Armored Corps. And I found that naval training was different than Army training. And so I was inclined to constantly ask my NCOs at the Armor School, okay, but why are we doing this? And the answer was almost always the same. Shut the fuck up, let's just do it. That was the NCO's way of saying to me, I have no idea why we're doing it this way. We've always done it this way. Just, I find, you know, I was a military professional and proud to be a military professional, but I always thought we did it backwards. And that's one of the ways that we can help. So I want to quickly just look at some subjects that, in case any of you have a question, that we didn't touch on. I didn't talk very much about maneuver warfare, which is now current NATO doctrine. And I'm very proud to be the first Canadian ever to introduce maneuver warfare in a Canadian military publication. That was 1988. I wrote an article. And interestingly, I got lots of letters from senior officers saying, Chuck, an interesting article, but absolute fantasy. It'll never happen. 2 officers whom I knew earlier in my life wrote to me, and they were naval officers. They were combat surface officers, and they both said, Chuck, this is exactly how the Navy fights. Good for you. The fact that we need to focus on the enemy more than we do. We tend to focus on the ground. We talked a little bit about the utility of military theory in everyday life. We didn't talk very much about leadership, although a little bit. The difference between philosophy, theory, and strategy, which goes back to my pyramid. Fighting in simulation and how we do it, because there are good ways to do it and bad ways to do it. And without strong guidance, sometimes people who use military simulations tend to focus on winning as opposed to learning. And it's not about winning, it's about learning, right? Because you can afford to kill your entire unit. No one's going to make you write letters home. You're not going to attend any funerals. But at the end, you get to brag that you won. Well, you wiped out your unit, but you won. That's a loss. And back to philosophy, one of the reasons that I embraced maneuver warfare so early was that it was the first time that I saw that maneuver warfare focused on the human element as opposed to the technical element of war. And of course, my favorite, we haven't talked about tank warfare. And I've got a couple of slides left that I can talk about real quick, unless there's a question that someone wants to raise here. Okay. So these are my concluding thoughts, right? So have a quick look. And then I want to show you that example where I said that with no change on the ground, you could change your combat power. But quickly have a look at this. Let's look at the, oh, before I forget. So that's my website, theenlightenedsoldier.com. So you can go to my website if you want to know more about my books and more about me. And I'm not very good at keeping it up to date, but I have some blogs there. But if you have questions in future, and you think you might like to engage me in discussion, I'm happy to receive an email from you anytime. And yeah, you feel free to write to me in your native language if it's one of those four, because I can speak those four languages. Otherwise, if you don't speak one of those, unfortunately, I'm not smart enough to learn Hungarian. It's a very difficult language. I would love to learn how, but I can't. Yeah, then ask your question in English. So where's the hidden slides? Here they are. Okay, let's okay, that has to do with simulation, which we talked about. Ability. Here's the example. All right, I'm going to, how do I unhide the slide? There it is. Unhide the slide. And then I'm going to unhide this slide. And I'm going to go back to this one.
Whilst you're doing that, Colonel, I will just say that you have loads of practical examples in your book, in your tactical book, which you can read through without the answers, and then you can get the answers, or at least the answers according to Chuck at the end of the book. So it's a really useful practical exercise you can do with yourself. And if you do it with yourself at various stages in your career, you'll probably think of it in different ways. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And in fact, you might be interested to know that Phil Halton and my publisher and retired commanding officer of the Queen's York Rangers and I are currently writing a book on how to teach tactics. So you'll see that on my website at some point in the future. Here's the example I like to use most often, because I take this from my own experience. So what you're looking at here is you are looking at an infantry battle group, and you should all be able to see my cursor. So there's a tank troop, right? Or two tank troops, 1, 2, 3. Oh, what have I done? Let's go back. Oh, I obviously triggered the move of this. So you've got a tank squadron that's in front of an infantry battle group of 3 companies. And those 3 tanks up front are the command group. So in a Canadian squadron, 19 tanks, but it's basically the same no matter how many tanks you've got. So, and this is what was normal for all of my career, where I would arrive with a tank squadron, and the first thing that the infantry commander would do, and I don't mean to denigrate infantry commanders, it's just the way they were trained. They would break my squadron in half, give half to a company, give another half to another company, and then off we go and lead the battle group, right? Because in open country, armor leads. And occasionally I would be lucky enough to work for an enlightened infantry officer, and I would say, Colonel, do this. Leave the squadron intact under my command. Because those two infantry company commanders may be really good at what they do. What they're not good at is using armor. They're really good at using infantry. I'm the guy who knows how to use armor, and I can use it across your entire front. And this almost doubles your combat power. Exactly the same layout on the ground. And the difference is I work directly for you, the same way that the three company commanders work directly for you. And when we bump up against something, you quickly tell me what it is that you want, and either give me an infantry company or tell me and an infantry commander to work together to solve the tactical issue, and then we'll move on. But if you break my squadron in half, you've cut your combat power in half unnecessarily. Everybody see that? No change at all in disposition. Complete difference in combat power. Just by understanding the difference between letting the guy who is the expert do his job, or blindly following the doctrine that says that, you know, in an infantry battle group, you break up the tanks and penny packet them to the infantry.
Colonel, out of interest, have you seen the reverse, where in a tank-heavy battle group with one infantry rifle company attached, do they break up the platoon so that each squadron has a load of dismounts to clear restricted terrain, or is the reverse model applied?
It comes and it goes. The tank battle groups are rare in Canada. So I commanded the largest battle group actually in NATO in 1991. And so picture all of this. So 3 tank squadrons, a reconnaissance squadron, and 2 infantry companies. And what I did was I put an infantry company behind each tank squadron. So a full squadron, a full company, kept a tank squadron out behind me as my reserve. But I didn't put the infantry under command of my squadron commanders. I said to the infantry officers and to my 2 squadron commanders, who obviously the squadron commanders had an advantage because they knew the way I thought, right? I just said to them, gentlemen, you need to work together. If it's obvious that the tank commander is going to make the decision, then make the decision. If it's obvious that the infantry commander is going to make the decision, make the decision. If you can't make the decision and I have to make the decision, it's not going to go well for either one of you. And they were like, got it, Colonel, no problem. Never had a problem with that. Never did.
Yeah, I think it's a useful illustration of a mental block, because all you've done is move the goose eggs around.
Yeah.
But
command and control.
Yeah, but I've personally experienced this where and I don't know what it is about the I'm a proud infantryman as well, but we love to have boundaries, clear delineation of ground. We like to be able to deal with our own problems and not have anyone interfere. Whereas the cavalry have been much more like, you call, I'll come. Lines are great if you have time, but if not, just give me somewhere to go to and somebody to kill and then get out my way. And it sounds a bit hooray Henry, but in an armored battle group, I actually thought that method was the one we needed to react to the changing circumstances, rather than, oh dear, it looks like the enemy appears to be on the boundary line between A and B company, which the enemy would always be, because one,
because they're not stupid.
Well, yeah, cynical me knows the enemy's played by the controllers, and 2, they are basically us, but just wearing a red hat. And the Zinni 3.5 hour thing goes into that lots about stop looking at the black and blue line, start looking at the red, because that's the truth. But I don't know where it gets into the mindset, but we and I had almost shouting matches with battle captains about this, because they just wanted it to be really tightly, rigidly controlled on the map, as opposed to actually beating the enemy. And there was no, trying to educate in an exercise is hard enough when everyone's on 3 hours sleep, if you're lucky. So it's an interesting thing about, like, there was nothing really the problem other than in our minds. It was a complete meta problem.
Yep. Well, it's funny you say that, because on Fallex, when I had my battle group, I got a Vandu company, francophones, and I got an RCR company. And I told them, I gave them my orders, and I didn't have a map. I used chalk on the side of my command post and chalked it all out. And the command and control relationship, as I said, was, Michelle, you will work with John, because they were both francophones. I had a francophone squadron commander, and Michelle said, sure, I can work with Jean. And on the other side, ironically, they were both called Mike. And I said, Mike, you will work with Mike. And the infantry commander put his hand up and said, Colonel, I don't see any boundaries. I said, there are no boundaries. Just follow Mike. But what's the command and control relationship? I just told you, work with Mike. The two of you can work it out. And he said, I'm sorry, Colonel, I can't accept that. I said, really? He said, I'm sorry, and our Patricia will appreciate this. He was a royal. And I said, fine, Mike, not a problem. You are under command of Mike. You will do everything he says. And I said, give me your map. He gave me his map, and I drew a line down the middle of the battle group area. And I said, do not cross this line, Mike. And he said, I'm good to go, Colonel. I got everything I need. So he didn't want the freedom. He wanted to be told what to do by my squadron commander. So I said, fine, Mike can do it for you. Bizarre. I found it bizarre. But we've come to the end of the time.
Yeah, we have. Although I think people are fairly happy to stay on. No one's exiting. So thank you for your presentation. I do have a question, but I'm also conscious I'm very good at making this the Ed Farron show. So if anyone else wants to ask a question, raise your hand or fire away. Go on, Ian. It's going to be about Marines, I bet.
No, not at all. At least not mostly. Chuck, it's been a while since I've seen you face to face, so it's good to see you again. And I was really excited to see you here on the Fight Club International lecture circuit. What I wanted to ask was in getting in sort of away from the more tangible realm into the information domain and how that ties into applications in military theory. So, information domain has been added as a part of sort of the multi-domain concept to a number of forces, to include the American forces. And whether or not you like the multi-domain, framework and concept, I think it's fair to say that the proliferation of individual information streams into the battlefield has an effect that hasn't really been seen sort of in the pre-internet age. And so my sort of a two-part question is, one, how do you think your more sort of senior folks need to incorporate or understand the information domain into how they strategize in terms of larger campaigns, but also down at the tactical level, I am going to pull the Marine part out, talking about the strategic corporal, where your most junior enlisted folks can have outsized impacts on the battlefield based on the perceptions of their actions. And in a 21st century battlefield where everybody's got a phone and can immediately blast a relatively minor tactical action out into the strategic stratosphere of information, how do you ensure that sort of information considerations are incorporated into the training and behavior and tactics of your most junior people? Because whether they believe in information believes in them, and one small wrong move or potentially one strong right move can have an outsized impact when everybody has a sensor and can see what you've done in almost real time.
Ian, it's good to see you, Marine. It's been a while since I got a chance to beat you up. Just for the
Let's do it. Let's go back to the old days.
for the rest of the audience, Ian and I know each other from way back, and he wrote one of the best books on the Boyd cycle that's in print today, and you should Ian, you should tell everybody where they can get a hold of that book. Anyway, to answer your question, I think we need to train our senior officers to understand that just because they have access to incredible amounts of data, they shouldn't necessarily expect to use it. We had a 3-star in our Army. I won't tell you his name. He actually is, I worked for him at one point. We were COs together. Bright guy, good soldier, but very anal retentive. And when he became a 3-star, his nickname amongst his staff was find me a rock, because you know the kind of direction would be go down to the beach and find me a rock. Well, what do you want the rock to look like, sir? I don't know yet. Go down and find me a rock, bring it back. If it's not what I want, I'll send you out again. And he would drive his staff absolutely crazy. And he always wanted more and more and more and more. And sadly, he became the commander when we had troops in Afghanistan. And a couple of times, I know, because I know the commanders in Afghanistan, they basically turned off their plotters, their pluggers, so that he couldn't see where their vehicles were, because he was reaching down trying to move individual vehicles. Because he felt that if the information was there and he could get it, it would help him make a better decision. But he couldn't make a decision because when he was about to, another piece of information would come in. And, you know, we all know this doctrinally as paralysis, information paralysis. But how often do we train our commanders to turn off the information? Because there comes a certain point when you need to make the decision. Waiting isn't going to make it better. And as I was taught in the Corps, a reasonable decision now is much preferable to a perfect decision later. Because later you may all be dead. It may be too late. Let me give you a real small hands-on example. So when I was the armor directing staff at our staff college, our student bodies were captains, and a bunch of my former subalterns were coming through the college. And in fact, we had this situation where one of my former officers was playing the role of div commander, and another one of my subalterns, who was a captain, was one of the brigade commanders in this very large map exercise. We called it Final Drive. It was their graduation exercise. And the div commander would be driving the brigade commanders crazy because he would constantly cause them to start their planning cycle over again before they could complete the cycle. And one of them came to me and said, Colonel, I'm ready to commit suicide because Paul is constantly changing the OODA loop on me, and I don't even get through halfway, and he starts me again. I said, well, the answer is to beat him at his own game. The answer, Hugh, is to go through the OODA loop faster. And he said, well, how can I, Colonel? How can I get through the loop faster than he's going through it? I said, simple. You are spending, how much time on map reconnaissance or time estimate, And so we started talking about this. I said, look, you need to go through the steps, right? Because if you don't go through the steps, you may miss one. But you've been through the steps so many times on this battle space, you know what the map looks like. So look at the map. Okay, I've done my map recce. And he said, what? I said, you know the map, but you've looked at the map, so you've done your map recce. Now you need to do a time estimate. What time is it now? Okay, it's 20 to 6. You need to be done in 1 minute. Okay, I've done my time estimate. That's the only way you're going to push through the loop faster than him and not trigger him to want more information, because you will then launch, and once you're launched, it's too late for him. But what we need to do, I think, is we need to not expect students, whether they're captains or majors or colonels, who are trying to understand how all of the pieces fit together. Because as you all know, it's one thing to be a company commander and ask your platoon commanders to go through the loop with you, the decision action loop. It gets so much more complicated when you're working with companies, battalions, brigades in a divisional setting, or if you're lucky enough to be in an American exercise where there's 3 divisions and a corps headquarters or a joint force headquarters. And the only way to do this is to write it into the scenario, force the commander to make decisions a lot faster and with a lot less information than he is comfortable with. And if you don't force him, he won't do it. My guys trained the Canadian brigade that went over and fought in Afghanistan, and they were subordinate to 11 Mountain Division out of Northern New York. The commander of 11 Mountain Division was, I can't remember his name, but he was a terrorist. His staff was absolutely terrified of him. His battlefield update brief, which is supposed to happen twice a day and not last longer than 20 minutes, lasted 4 hours. In a 24-hour cycles, his staff spent 8 hours just briefing him. Imagine that. They were exhausted by the end of every day. And this was an exercise. It wasn't even actually in theater. So again, I think the answer to your question is you need to build it into your training. Because if you don't, then commanders they'll do what they want. They're the commander. All right.
Hey, Chuck, can I try and get the last question in if people need to go?
I don't need to go.
But
yeah, but
no, I'm happy to talk all night. I'm just conscious. I kind of want to ask about. I almost want to say, what the hell is going on with our senior officer selection if we've got frontal attack colonels and pontificating narcissistic generals? But that might be a subject for another webinar. But I do wonder if we can start to filter out some of these bad personality traits in the MS system. But my actual question is, there tends to be 2 models for officer career training, or officer academies. One is the Sandhurst model, which is the 1-year military college, and the other is the sort of West Point 4-year military university.
Right.
And it would seem to me that the West Point model would create a more academically minded and therefore theory-centric officer versus the Sandhurst model, if not for nothing more than the fact that everyone is sleep deprived at Sandhurst and learning. You are not doing high-level learning a lot of the time. You're doing lower-level learning, which means rote and copycatting from what everyone else is doing and regurgitating information that sounds good because your color sergeant said it, etc. And there is a time and place for that at the start of your career. So I just wonder, where do you think we can talk about, later in life, professional military education, but I just wonder at the starting point for an officer's education, which model do you think is the best for getting the theory embedded early?
Well, I'm a product of, as you call it, the West Point model, and it is the West Point model because the Royal Military College of Canada was based on West Point. The problem with the 4-year academic model, and we are going through a lot of soul searching right now in the Canadian military because we're not happy with what the military college is producing. The problem with that model is that because you've got 4 years, a lot of people tend to insert things that aren't part of the curriculum because they have a hobby horse, right? They think it's a good idea to teach the cadets the following. Oh, the cadets need to learn this. Oh, wait, the cadets need to learn this. On top of that, you have academic requirements. So and very quickly, the curriculum becomes so overloaded that you tend to lose sight of what it is that you're trying to produce. And the reality is, you're trying to produce a subaltern, a second lieutenant, commissioned officer, who is ready to join a unit, whether it's a ship or an air squadron or an infantry platoon or whatever it is that is ready to join that unit and immerse themselves in the culture of their profession at that level. But that's not what we're doing. We're forcing them to focus more and more on academics, which is fine, you know, but instead of the problem with the West Point model is that it's based on an engineering degree, which is why Norwich was founded, because the guy who founded Norwich was an instructor at West Point, and he was a humanist, and he wanted the cadets to study philosophy, poetry, art, you know, the psychology, you know, as it was in the 19th century. And I agree. I mean, I think that the fact that we offer physics degrees and engineering degrees and at the Royal Military College and at West Point tends to break the focus away from what the purpose of the academy is, to produce that second lieutenant. And the focus then becomes survive the military culture long enough to get your degree and worry about what happens after graduation. Well, Sandhurst, different model. And, you know, but even Sandhurst, I think, needs to be extended, because the time that you're there isn't long enough to get you ready for the modern battlefield, I don't think. So probably somewhere between Sandhurst and the West Point model is the sweet spot. I don't know.
There is a dissenting view, and I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. Jim Storr, quite the contrarian speaker. We had him on a previous webinar, which I've shared.
Oh, I know
with
Jim.
The group. Yeah, and also we're all sort of slaves to our own experience. So I did the 44-week commissioning course, which is the standard what we have now. There's a struggle to, everyone wants to pour more stuff into it, but then you're like, what do we take out? And the answer is probably like sleep, because it can't be drill, because there's stuff that needs to happen with that. But he went through, when it was it was almost half the length, I think, like 6 months or even shorter, because there were different levels, of course, depending on if you were graduate or non-graduate and all that kind of stuff. And he often says, what the hell are they learning there? Which just shows that there can be a contrarian view. What I would say is that when you get to unit, there is so little time to learn any of this stuff, and theories on war are secondary to barracks procedures, and if you think tactical drills are bad, then, you know, barrack drills are even worse in terms of curtailing the mind. And, you know, why are we copying information from this left-hand screen to this right-hand screen? Because we need to do it, and, you know, and the computer systems don't talk, and, you know, all the other great positive retention stuff. So there is a dissenting view out there. I just thought I'd voice that for the video and for the audience. Does anyone have any more questions?
Can I give a short takeaways from the discussion?
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So thank you for the discussions. For our perspective, especially in the Philippine Marines, I think we need to develop our own philosophies, since most of our doctrines are, you know, from the U.S. Marine Corps and other techniques and TTPs. So as discussed earlier, I think we realized that we must have our own philosophies on what we are, especially if we're going to make our strategies later on, particularly understanding our future adversary in the West Philippine Sea and other conflicts. So thank you guys for this discussion.
Can you see what that says?
Armed Forces of the Philippines.
The Philippines, yeah.
Yeah, this was a little gift given to me by the Deputy Chief of Staff for Education, Training, and Doctrine of the Philippine Armed Forces.
Yeah.
I spent a wonderful week with them, and I must say, some of the Philippine Marines that I dealt with, I wouldn't want to meet them at night alone. But yes, I think you're right. And you make a very good point.
So I'm sort of going to close us out. My closing challenge to everyone here is, I started this in one of the early webinars. Today, somewhere in the world, someone is training to kill you. What are you doing? And if you're copying information from the left screen to the right screen, there's probably something more you should be doing to counter that. So what is the one thing that you can do in your organization to prepare it for the next war and save lives? That can be a minor thing. If we all do one small thing, then maybe we'll turn this oil tanker around in time. For anyone who wants to forward this on to people who couldn't make it tonight or dropped off, etc., then this will be on our usual YouTube webinar location. So just search Fight Club International on YouTube. There are lots of playlists. You'll go into rabbit holes if you go into the first couple, but there's one called webinars. It will be loaded into there. And please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future ones. As ever, we have a number of social media platforms. I've mentioned YouTube. We also have LinkedIn and X, formerly Twitter. Please follow us on that. We do post regularly with everything we're doing. And the website is also where we have a lot of activities and information. And if you are not a member of a Fight Club and you do want to join, then just head to there, click the join button and sign up. We have a number of chapters, a family of 9 established national chapters and growing. And the Philippines will soon become our 10th chapter in not too distant future. I would now invite everyone to the webinar bar, but we've kind of already done that in the course of the discussion. So if you are on Discord and you want to go to the webinar bar and chat about this, then fill your boots. I'll be closing this out in 10 seconds.